Dear students, today we are going to understand what are intensive and extensive properties. Now, in the morning, I prepared a cup of coffee. Now, as soon as I prepared the cup of coffee, my wife came to me and she said she also wants to drink a cup of coffee. Well, instead of preparing one more cup of coffee, what I did, I simply split my cup of coffee into two parts. So I filled two cups, half. Now, when I did this, right, let us try to understand something. Now, let me say the initial temperature of the cup of coffee was around 80 degrees centigrade. And the total volume of the cup of coffee I prepared was, let me say, 100 ml. Now, when I divided it into two parts, what do you think would be the temperature? Probably, assuming not much time has elapsed, the temperature will remain same 80 degrees centigrade in both the cups of coffee. But if you look at the volume, definitely the volume has halved and it will only be is equal to how much? 50 ml in each cup. By this, we understood that when the coffee was divided into two, the temperature remained unchanged, whereas the volume changed, it became half. This is exactly what intensive and extensive properties are. Let us try to understand using a thermodynamic system. Now, let me say I have this box full of molecules, and all the molecules are having some random motion. Now, first of all, if I want to define the system, this is my system, I want to study this box full of molecules. Now, if I want to define the system, I have to define some of the characteristics of these molecules. And for example, I have to first state what is the temperature, what is the pressure, what is the volume, what is the mass, what is the number of molecules, what is the density, and probably what is the internal energy, blah, 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 blah. There are so many properties that I can define, right? So all these characteristics becomes the property of the system which is required to define the system. Now, if I divide this box into two parts, what do you think will happen to temperature? The temperature will remain same. Now, if you know what is temperature, right? Temperature is because of the vibration of the molecules, the energy processed by the molecules because of its vibration, which is also known as the sensible energy. Well, we can discuss that in a separate video. So that is not changed. Vibration has not changed. So the temperature does not change. Similarly, pressure also does not change. Why? Because pressure is the force, right? It is the measure of the force with which the molecules are striking the walls of the container, and that does not change, and so does pressure. But if you see, what happens to mass? Mass becomes half. What happens to volume? Volume becomes half. What happens to, say, internal energy? Internal energy becomes half. So you see, some of the properties does not change if I divide the system into two, whereas some of the properties, they do change. On this basis, we define intensive and extensive properties. So intensive properties are those properties which are independent of mass, whereas extensive properties are those properties which are dependent on the mass of the system. So what are examples of some of the intensive properties? Temperature, pressure, density, and some of extensive property: volume, internal energy, enthalpy. Now, this was a big concern for the scientist. Why? Because if the system is defined based on some of the extensive properties like volume, internal energy, enthalpy, which are very important properties, by the way, right? Now, this properties are going to change as soon as the mass of the system changes. So it is very difficult to analyze if things are constantly changing. So what the scientists did, they invented a new kind of property, the specific properties. So when the intensive properties are divided by mass, right, they get converted into intensive properties. And this are known as specific properties. Now let us try to understand. Now, if I divide, say, volume, if I divide volume with mass, what we have is specific volume. When we divide, say, internal energy by mass, so it no longer is dependent on mass, it becomes specific internal energy. When we divide enthalpy with mass, it becomes specific enthalpy. So these are all specific properties. Whereas these are all extensive properties. So basically, specific properties are extensive properties which were divided by mass and converted into intensive properties. Now, if you have understood this question, this concept, right, you will be able to answer this question. A tank contains 2 kg of gas. If the mass becomes 4 kg, while keeping the state same, which of the properties remains unchanged? Please answer this question in the comment.